Welcome to the Contrarian Capitalist podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by Chris Irons of Quoth the Raven, or QTR's Fringe Finance, as you might know the channel by. Chris, thank you for your time today.
Thanks for inviting me.
First of all, obviously, there's a whole myriad of shit we can talk about. Be yourself, swear as much as you want, just be yourself. Two things I
You don't
wanted
have
to
to worry
touch on.
about that.
Two things I just wanted to touch on first. Number one, I know that recently I don't know how many days it would be now, but you've recently said it's you stopped drinking and stuff like that. Just a bit of a deep dive into that. What prompted that, and do you feel better after X amount of days of being alcohol, gambling free, etc.?
Well, I'm coming up on 90 days here, so I'm well into it. And any like recovery program that you go through, they always say 90 days is like a key point. Um, I do feel better. What prompted it? It wasn't like some crazy rock bottom. Um, More so just they say sick and tired of being sick and tired of being sick and tired. I hear a lot in these rooms. People throw around that phrase a lot.
Hmm.
For me, it was um, with alcohol. For example, I had taken absences from drinking over the last 5 years, maybe 20, 30 days at a time. Um, it took me a really long time to understand that using alcohol and to some degree gambling, betting on sports or going and sitting at a slot machine or whatever, um, that I was using those things to treat a degree of anxiety that I was carrying around with myself and had been carrying around dating back to really when I was 17, 18 years old is when it first really started to manifest. And um it sounds ridiculous, but it took me like 20 years to learn that I was exacerbating the issue and not helping it. Like a drink is a quick fix. There's been many times over the last 90 days where I've had a day where I come back and I'm a little on edge and I said, oh man, like two Guinnesses would set me right now. That would be enough to drop the anxiety off like a coat of armor dropping off of me.
Mhm.
Um, but really, in essence, what you're doing is you're borrowing your time and your stress and your well-being from the next day. And that seems like a very simple concept to a lot of people that talk about alcohol, certainly, and gambling as well. Like certainly I've heard people say to me in the last 20 years that quitting booze will actually help with your anxiety, but um it really wasn't until I heard it from a therapist who explained. So I've been in various forms of therapy for like 10 years, but a therapist kind of explained it to me from the chemical imbalance standpoint, what actually happens the next day when you're hungover and how that can lead you down a path of anxiousness, which begets the next drink or the going and betting on a game or whatever it is. And it wasn't until that moment that I had like really an aha kind of moment myself, because then the next time I had 10 or 14 days and I hand to God, like I wasn't a blackout drunk. I was drinking probably, I would say 3 to 4 drinks 3 to 4 days a week was
Mhm.
probably my regular. So if you go around my local pubs, like nobody's going to tell you Chris is out of control. I've ever seen Chris like hammered, like never the case. But it was just drinking that didn't need to happen. And the after I had learned that, I was could possibly be doing more harm than good on the alleviating anxiety front, the next couple go rounds of sobriety that I had, where I would take 2 weeks or I would take a month or 20 days off, I was willing to take note of how different I felt. Usually I found within the 10 to 14 day mark, I would wake up someday around that point and really feel a sense of calm and peace and tranquility that I hadn't felt. It was completely foreign to me.
Hmm.
And so it was only being able to notice that, which this all sounds kind of dumb, but really a lot of people kind of go about their day like in the movie of their lives and never really stop and recognize their feelings or examine their feelings or their thoughts. It was only upon recognizing that I was like, like maybe there's something here. And as I started to do those stints more and more, last year I did maybe like a sober October or a sober January or something. And in the years prior, I was in a relationship where the woman I was with, she didn't drink, so it was really easy not to drink. Um, and I just kind of noticed, and then it kind of became like, well, why are you doing it at all? If there's no benefit at all, like I can go now. I went to a dinner last night and had a great time sipping my coffee and sipping my sparkling water and held a great conversation for hours and was socializing, and everything was fine. And so another saying I've heard a bunch of times is a person drinks to feel like a sober person feels normally. And what I didn't understand is you could get to that by stopping. It's just going to suck for a little bit first, then you have to, like, as with withdrawal with anything, you have to kind of ride that out. And with gambling was the same deal. It was just things that I didn't need to be doing, that I was doing to distract myself, either from, in a lot of these recovery programs, they'll hand out these cards that say HALT on them, HALT, and it'll say, like, are you hungry, anxious, lonely, or tired? And usually it was one of those things, or bored. Loneliness fit in there as well, too. I had nothing going on that particular night and I wasn't inspired to write or whatever. Hey, I could throw on, fucking Arkansas Pine Bluff versus Hawaii, which is the most inconsequential basketball game in the history of collegiate sports, that all of a sudden becomes the goddamn fucking Super Bowl for me when I'm sitting there, drinking a beer, by the way, too. God, the two went beautifully well together. Nothing like having a couple cold beers and putting money on a football game. But after a while, you realize, like, okay, like, it's not serving me anymore. It was beyond the losing money, because really, to some degree, I had chalked that up as tuition, as the cost of doing the things that I enjoyed. It would be nice to have that money back, but it's not coming back. And so, that's okay. I can live with that. But really, for me, it was the recognizing that I don't want to be engaged in doing that, 2 hours a night, because it hijacks your decision making. It hijacks the way that you feel for the day. It determines the outcomes of how you spend your time. And I have things that I'd rather be doing. I'd rather be writing on my blog. I'd rather be playing chess. I'd rather be talking to my parents. I'd rather be, going for a run. I'd rather be reading. I have a million things I'd rather be doing. And so it just took, and it was similar with the stock market, like, I don't trade actively anymore. I don't trade options anymore, because I would sit and I would watch tick by, putting aside the fact that, like, there were so many times where I had a thesis right and I was unable to make money off of it because I didn't have the trading discipline, which is a huge, like, red flag. Hey, you shouldn't be doing this. But it would, more so than that, is it would captivate me, and I'd be sitting there watching these things on a tick by tick basis, and I'd look up and my whole day would be gone. And so, like, man, how beautiful it is to get up this morning and go for a 10-mile run and not be worrying about, like, what the fucking PPI number is going to be, or, if what the, dollar yen fucking pair is at. Like, I can still keep up with the news and read the financial stuff, and I can still write my blog and talk about sectors and names that I find interesting, but I don't need to be engrossed in it. So all of it, the alcohol, the sports gambling, is a huge time suck. And there were some alarming moments too, where I knew that I was playing with fire a little bit. A couple decisions that you make. I was telling my parents a story the other day about, I was walking home from the bar. I don't know, 6 months ago or something, and there was a guy sitting out front with huge rims and an old Crown Victoria blasting music. And like my neighborhood's like a pretty residential area. And I know my neighbors. And he was out there at like 1 in the morning, and I don't know what he was doing, but he had a fucking Hennessy bottle, and he was basically just throwing a private fucking hip hop concert by himself with his girlfriend, blasting the music and shit. Now, walking home from the bar, with 3, 4 pints of me, I walked up to him and I'm like, "What the fuck are you doing?" I didn't even try to be diplomatic about it, which was stupid, very stupid. I'm like, dude, pack this fucking mess up and get the fuck out of here. Like, you don't belong in this neighborhood. Like, take this shit and go somewhere else. Like, there's people in this building trying to sleep. Like, I'm going to be trying to sleep in 5 minutes as soon as I get my ass in there. Like, I don't know what you think you're doing here, but like, get this shit out of here. And the dude, he bellied up to me, and it was this big fucking to do. And like, nothing happened. The guy packed his shit up and left. But like, that guy could have had a gun. Like, more people than not have guns in Philadelphia. So like, I'm lucky I'm not dead. So that's an instance where like I look back on that the next day. I'm like, that didn't need to happen. Like, I had nothing to prove. I didn't need to be. I could have went in. I could have called the cops. I could have fucking tried to be diplomatic, but I didn't. I made the wrong decision there. And so you have enough of those moments where you're flying close to the sun, or like once in a while when like, I would tell somebody in Atlantic City, like, hey, you're never going to see me again. And then fucking, 6 months later, I bump into that person. They're like, I thought you said you're never going to see you again. I'm like, oh yeah, shit, you're right. Like you have enough of those moments. You're like, all right, like I'm 42 and I need to shed my skin here a little bit and make some serious decisions about the direction I'm taking my life. And so I'm grateful to be able to do that, because I look around and I see people stuck in all kinds of patterns, and I'm still stuck in many patterns that I have, but I'm grateful to be able to recognize it a little bit and then do whatever work I can do to try to evolve and grow, because I think that's the name of the game with life. You do the same thing enough, especially when it doesn't bring you the right feelings.
Mm-hmm.
When it brings you feelings of guilt and shame, and you do those things over and over and you don't even know why you're doing them. That's, they'll say in a 12-step program, it's a path to prison, insanity, or death. And that's because it is like, it becomes progressive. And so for me, like, my goal is to not wind up with prison, insanity, or death, but rather to be in Central Park having a nice run, or going out and having cheesesteaks and watching the Eagles or something. So that's that story.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you sharing that, because I know that that's going to resonate, I think, with a lot of people. And obviously, men in general aren't as good at talking about stuff as women. So I'm sure that what you've just said is going to help someone out there at some point. So I really appreciate you saying that. You actually just my second question, I think you've just mentioned them. That must have felt absolutely fantastic in Super Bowl, absolutely caning the Chiefs, because I enjoyed that. I thought that was great. That was my second question. How did that all feel? How did that go down in Philadelphia? I bet you it was chaos.
It felt great, but I just want to rewind real quick and just say that, like, gaining a very little modicum of clarity over the last 90 days, and taking a look at the landscape, specifically as it relates to sports betting and the stock market, and looking at how easy it is to now, you have things like Polymarket and Kalshi that are starting to kind of merge with Robinhood, and you have the crypto universe, and you have DraftKings, and you can get action 24 hours a day now on anything. Like 20 years ago, I had to call a bookie, right? And it was limited to, baseball and football, and that was it, or 20 years ago, you couldn't even trade options online. Scott Trade was the first like discount brokerage I remember. And I don't even think you could trade options right off the bat. And the landscape has changed so much now that you can get action on anything, and you can get it on the excruciating minutia of things too. So you can like in the market, like we could go into the futures market at 2 o'clock in the morning and find something to try to make 5 ticks on. Anything. It doesn't even matter. Soybeans, fucking euro dollars, whatever. And conversely, there's some bullshit on the TV right now. The Hebrew national sponsored corn dog or cornhole championships or WNBA, where not only can you bet on the outcome, but you can bet on every single play. Is the next basket going to go in? Is the next pitch going to be a strike? Is the next, and that is extremely seductive and extraordinarily terrifying now as I look back on it. And this is coming from somebody that has, put those bets in. And so like, I'm not, I've flown close to the sun in that regard and know what it's like to bet on, whatever fucking Korean ping pong at 3 a.m. And the fact that you could do that is, it's terrifying, and it really makes it very easy for these things to kind of get their hooks in. And so, for me, what helped was surrounding myself with people that were like me. Like for me, it was getting into like a group setting where I'm surrounded by people that have dealt with the same thing and are, some people haven't gambled in 30 years, other people haven't gambled in 2 days, but everybody kind of knows, everybody kind of feels the same way. And everybody is kind of in one way or the other the same. And for me, that was very helpful to gain some clarity and some perspective. And, I would encourage anybody that is, having similar types of issues to find a room, whether it's AA, NA, GA, get to a room, go sit in a meeting, see what it's like. It's not, there's a big stigma about meetings that it's, some horrifying, humiliating experience in a church basement, a smoky church basement. It's really not. It's a bunch of, otherwise normal people sitting around. I was sitting at the bar across the street from where I live the other day, and the bartender and I ordered a Guinness Zero, and the bartender came over and he said, did you quit for good, or are you just not drinking tonight? And I said, yeah, I'm just trying not to drink. I'm taking it one day at a time. And I said, I worked in the industry for a long time. I worked in the industry for 15 years and, did plenty of drinking when I was bartending. And the guy was like, oh yeah, like I know what that's all about. And I haven't had a drink in 7 years, and started to tell me his story as well. We were about the same age. I think we both had our fill of the bar scene and the drinking that goes with it. And, going around the pub and, I'd go around the pub at like 6 a.m. to watch soccer. Back before it was on TV, you had to watch Setanta. There was one pub that had it. We started drinking Guinness at 6 a.m. But him and we had like a 30-minute long conversation about some of the trials and the tribulations and the horror stories and the other people that are, the drunks coming into the bar and the reasons we stopped and the weird situations we got ourselves in and this, that, and the other. And at the end of it, started talking about, meetings and therapy. And there's a saying that, you only need 2 people to have a meeting. And I was just thinking to myself, like, we had a little private meeting there, which was 30 minutes of, him and me just giving each other a little therapy, talking about, why we stopped drinking and why it wasn't working for us. And that's all anybody can expect if they get into a room. It's just a bunch of like people that have something in common, just sitting around talking about why it didn't work for them and sharing what works and what doesn't work for them. So there's nothing to be intimidated about. And there's no honor lost in seeking out help if it's something that you think that you need help with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's some great points well made. And as you said, all I can do is sort of back up what you've just said. If you listen to this and you do have any challenges that are going on, yeah, as you say, from a man with experience, just try and have a chat with someone, go somewhere, try and do something about it. I know that's easier said than done, but
Right.
if this podcast helps and it gets you on the first step, then that's probably the most important thing, I would imagine.
Yeah, it can take forever, man. It took me 20 years. And you know what's funny? And even now, I'm not guaranteed tomorrow that I won't drink or that I won't go down to Atlantic City, like so I'm just focused on today. I'm just worried about today. Like, am I do the right thing today? Am I gonna read my book today? Like, am I gonna do the work today? And that's all I can focus on. But yeah, it sometimes it takes, and you go into the room once in a while, or even my therapist has told me, because my therapist is also in recovery, would tell me like, I went for a year and it worked, and then I wasn't done drinking yet. So I went back out and I drank for 6 months, and then I came back. Like, you don't know until you know it's time, and it's got to come from in here. There's, nothing from the outside can convince you or tell you that it's time. You'll know when it's time. And in November, to put a bow on all of this, back to your first question, really in November, I just knew. I'm like, all right, it's time to really make a big stride here.
Good on you, man. I just work say thanks for sharing. I appreciate it. It's quite a personal question to start off with. I thought that'd be a more poignant place to start rather than let's go and talk
Sure.
about DOGE or whatever, because it's a bit different. I think it's mental health's important at the end of the day.
It's everything.
Yeah, it has to be. Yeah, it really has to be.
It's
I've lost my trail of thought. Yeah, Eagles.
it's
That was
where
that
it's
was my next point. Yeah, but yeah.
but just the way you're saying, mental health is where everything starts. You can't be anything for anybody until you're okay with yourself. And so it's that's square one. It comes before your job. It comes before how you treat those around you. It's the nerve center of who you are. And when you get that right, everything else starts to fall into place a little bit. But there's no, you know, there's the stigmas around mental health are horrific, and because it's very real. The world that we live in stands at very stark odds with what our evolutionary biology tells us we should and shouldn't be doing. And so it's not some crazy concept to grasp that we malfunction, and we do things we're not supposed to do, and we don't process trauma, or we don't process the feelings that the outside world or social norms give us when we're not supposed to be processing them the right way, because they don't really make sense to us, the way that we've evolved. And so it's kind of putting a shortstop between the world and the ways that it make you feel, and how you process it and respond to it. And there has to be some, like, in the computer world, they call it like assembly language, right? There has to be some translation there that allows you to kind of respond and conduct yourself with the cognizance of understanding a little bit of what's going on, because otherwise you get trapped in a pattern, or you let your defense mechanisms dictate your actions for you without thinking about it. And that's horrifying, because then you're setting off another cycle of bad actions and reactions, or you do things and you don't know why you're doing them. And that's it's a terrible feeling. So mental health is everything. Therapy saved my life, no questions asked. I've been in and out of therapy for 10 years. It's I would hate to see where my life would be today if I hadn't had essentially a nervous breakdown 10 years ago, and threw my hands up in the air and said, fuck it, I'm out of ideas. I can't fix the problem, which is what I always thought. I always thought, oh, I'm smart, like, I can fix this. I couldn't. I needed help. I need somebody else to unwind all the mess in my head for me. Like, I didn't know what being calm was about. I didn't understand the difference between fight or flight mode and just our regular everyday being at peace with ourselves and with the world. And that all comes from mental health. And there's no honor lost in going and talking to somebody. As a matter of fact, I think everybody should speak to somebody to some degree, because it's done wonders for me, and it's done wonders for a lot of people around me. So, all right, we can talk about the Eagles now. I'm sorry, I don't want to turn this into a Dr. Phil episode, but It was nice to see the Eagles win the Super Bowl for sure.
Yeah, okay. I think a lot of NFL fans were probably quite happy. Uh, yeah, I imagine that a lot of NFL fans are quite happy that it wasn't a three-peat. And I know there's been a lot of shit going on season just gone about refs and this and that and this and that. But yeah, I think unless you're in the NFC East and you're not an Eagles fan, I think most people enjoyed that. So
I think
I'm
so. I
glad.
think so too. And like, the Chiefs were a stone's throw away from being 6-7 for the year. I mean, it was just I felt like every week they won, and every week I was watching the end of their game or I was watching Red Zone or something, and they would win by like a missed field goal or a blocked field goal or some bullshit pass or a ref's call or whatever. And and they weren't really the real deal this year that their record made them out to be. And the swooning over them in Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce, it's like fucking enough,
Yeah.
So it was nice to see the nation kind of rooting for the Eagles. And when they came out and did the introductions, you could tell there were a lot of Eagles fans there because the stadium was really loud for the Eagles. And so it was great. The universe is healing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I totally agree. I think in terms of where do we go from here? The first word that I had on my head was Doge because that's one of your most recent articles, and it looks at basically Doge is what happens when trust in government hits zero. So we can either go down the Doge route or look at generic goings on. Pick your poison, and we'll go from there.
Well, the article that I published last night or yesterday, I finished it up yesterday, was just talking about Doge because a lot of people have asked me about it. What do you think about it? And I've been critical of Elon Musk in the past, and so a lot of those people come back to me and ask, like, because to me, there is plenty of waste, fraud, and abuse out there. And to me, I've always been critical of the way that tax money has been spent because the government just simply isn't a great capital allocator. And so, as I wrote, I think, are there better ways to do things like with more nuance and more planning and, is there a careful way to go in and do nip and tuck at these agencies? Yeah, I'm sure there is. But the thing is, when you do that, like, you're going to get pushback on every single fucking hey, let's nip this here. Hey, let's take this. Every time you do that, you're going to go, and what Doge is kind of doing is just tearing the Band-Aid off. I mean, you have these like 19-year-old psychopaths in the like sensitive government systems like the treasury data. And I mean, that's a little unnerving. I'm not going to lie to you. But having said that, there is a part of me that just continues to feel like, well, this is what we get, because when you start seeing some of the things that taxpayer money is spent on, right, just funneling down from the fact that, like, all right, we have $36 trillion in debt, right? Why do we have that? Well, because we're running $1.5 trillion deficit or $2 trillion deficit every year. It's like, all right, well, why are we doing that? Well, it's because we got all this fucking pork and shit that we can't stop spending on. And at the same time, you have an obsession with like shaking down the average taxpayer in the country too for what are really ultimately amounts to de minimis amounts of of additional tax revenue. This hiring of 100,000 new IRS agents and things like that, when really the problem can be managed by how we spend. Like we're bringing in something $3 or $4 trillion a year in tax receipts already. Lest we forget the whole thought process of like, well, if we can just print the money, what do we need taxes for anyways? It's an MMT discussion for another day. But the notion that we can't balance a budget when we have $3 or $4 trillion in tax receipts coming in every year is, to me, it's insane. I've said on podcasts in the past that if me and you, Robert, or me and whoever I'm talking to could sit down and take a good hard look at things, that I'm sure we could cut a significant amount of fat out of the government in a way where nobody's going to notice any substantial differences when they leave the house every day. And so far, the kind of things that Doge has kind of pointed out, like, funding, whatever, they're just making this up, but it's shit like, transgender coloring books in Zimbabwe. It's like, all right, like $30 million grant. like, okay, like what are we doing? And then you start moving into the bigger numbers, right? The Pentagon has failed 7 audits in a row, and we're sending hundreds of $billions overseas in foreign aid. Like when's that money getting audited? Like where's that money going? Like exactly. And so to me, it seems befuddling to be worrying about people making $600 Venmo transactions, and shaking down a taxi driver for an extra $100 or whatever, while we're moving around these vast sums of money that are not being accounted for, that are undoubtedly going to enrich people, like these NGOs, and all these politicians that wind up on these $200,000 a year salaries, but wind up getting rich. There's just by virtue of what we've seen so far, it telegraphs that there is significantly more under the surface. And so to me, the idea of just going in and being like a fucking bull in a china shop like these guys are doing, is it the most careful way to do things? No. Does it make me feel a little nervous? A little bit. But it has to happen, because I think now, at least, when the establishment powers start to wrest some control back, or or the smoke clears a little bit, people will, this will have been a lesson for people. And as more and more of these stories come out, and we see more and more who's on the take and who is, essentially benefiting from the gravy train that the taxpayer is funding, I think it will hopefully, at least for a couple of years, continue to ring as some sort of lesson for how we spend going forward. And so, as I wrote in my piece, there's positives and there's negatives to the Doge thing, in my opinion. But right now, I'm just kind of observing without judgment. I'm just like, I do when I'm meditating. I'm trying to observe my thoughts without judging them. And so it's just, the Chinese say, may you live in interesting times. Certainly, these times are very interesting. For me, it's just, it's baffling that I took the subway yesterday, and I had therapy in South Philly, and so I took the subway from South Philly up to City Hall, and then I transferred and took the L, and I took 2 rides, a total of 25 minutes. And the subway in Philadelphia is just disgusting. Like it is disgusting. Like it's almost unbearable. It's almost unrideable. It is. There's piss and shit and homeless people and fucking the smells, and like it's disgusting. And like to have people come into that city and then go to try to ride the subway, like it's embarrassing. And I look at something like that, and I just think to myself, like, you go to a place like Montreal, which is one of my favorite cities, and you go ride their metro, and there's no homeless people, and the subways are clean, and they're new, and they're efficient, and they come every 2 minutes. And like, the STM, the Société Transport de Montreal, whatever the fuck it's called, like, it's masterful the way that mass transit runs. Now, I know Quebec's taxes are very high, relative to the US. But I think to myself, like, how much higher comparative to what people are earning, do they really have to be for me to be in the greatest country in the world that is, on the verge of taxing people for their unrealized gains, which is a completely asinine concept? What does it take for me to be able to get into a subway in my own city and not have it smell like piss or shit, or see what I saw yesterday, which was I got in the car, there were 4 people passed out, 4, homeless people passed out in the front of the car. There was defecation on the ground. There was piss in a bottle. There were syringes. Like, there's like an absolute horrifying, like, apocalypse, like a hellscape, And then I watched things like Xi Jinping goes to San Francisco and they clean the city up in 48 hours. So don't tell me that, like, oh, the problem is, like, we're just, billionaires aren't paying their fair share or some shit like that. You know what I mean? Like, look, nobody wants billionaires to pay taxes more than I do. Okay. Like, pay your fair share. But like at some point, when are we going to look at how we're allocating this capital? And I guarantee you, me and you and a bunch of fucking monkeys throwing darts could get together in a room and figure out a way to rejigger how our tax receipts are spent so that we can at least run some type of surplus and clean things up a bit. And it's just holding people accountable. And therein lies the basis for the government spending versus private sector spending argument. There's no profit motive at the government, which is why people move as slow as they can to still get the job done. There's no incentive to, produce any type of quality. And in the private sector, there's a profit motive, which incentivizes people to provide a great service, to provide a great product, to work in a way that's going to bring people back. But, when I go to ride Amtrak, it's just Amtrak or New Jersey Transit or SEPTA. There's no FedEx, there's no private company that is offering a train service from Philadelphia to New York that I have the option of going with because they get my business, just like FedEx gets my business instead of the U.S. Postal Service. So, therein lies the genesis of the argument. Government is just not a great capital allocator, and that's it. And so to think that it's some far cry or stretch to assume that there's waste, fraud, and abuse out there is ridiculous, because all government spending is incentivizing waste, fraud, and abuse. And so, at the end of the day, DOGE had to happen, because when we had the adults in the room over the last 4 years, there was no responsibility at all. None. The money supply was going through the roof. The debt was being racked up at an ever accelerating rate. And the spending was through the roof. There was spending for everything and anything. And if you don't think politicians and people close to these circles in DC aren't getting rich off of taxpayer money, you are sorely fucking mistaken. And that is something every American should think about every year when they cut their tax check, and they look at how much they paid in taxes, which is like, where is that money going? And so, I think people are going to start asking that question now. And as DOGE gifts us these little nuggets of information that, here's where your tax money's been going, people I think are going to ask even more. And I think that's good. I don't necessarily think, spending tax money in one way or the other is, all told like horrific, although I do think taxation is burdensome, but it's holding people accountable on how it's spent. And that's really, I think, where the rubber has to meet the road.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think from what I've seen, in the news, and with Zero Hedge X, and again following yourself as well, it seems to me that there's, I don't want to go down the route of saying divide and conquer, but it seems to me that there's not enough outrage from people that are left leaning, and again, there's not enough questions being asked. Now, I wonder if that's because, or people are getting outraged, politicians are getting outraged because DOGE could discover something that shouldn't be discovered, and I'll use that term loosely.
Sure.
So I find that fascinating. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that at all, Chris.
People don't get it. First off, people on the left, they don't understand it. The idea of taxing the rich plays to, people's emotions more so than it plays to, practicality. Because if you do something like tax unrealized gains, which to somebody in, a middle or lower class situation is going to sound like a great idea. What they're not thinking of is the capital fight that's going to leave the country as a result of that. And so net, it's going to be regressive for the U.S. economy, which is why, the idea of less taxation and putting the money back into the pockets of people and allowing them to, empower how they spend it, and then, creating a private sector incentive for a lot of the things that the government does, to me makes more sense. People on the left, it's a great talking point for them. When you see AOC show up at some award show in a dress that says tax the rich on it, and you're just like, here she is at some gala getting out of a limousine, making a political statement while she's like, in some Versace custom made dress. Like people they don't see. It's like a trendy like talking point that it doesn't cost you anything to throw it out there and say it. Hey, tax the rich. When are people going to pay their fair share? It's like, okay, like a lot of these people have 40-50% effective tax rates. Like what, at what point does, how much is too much, because then you get people, anytime you try to follow the logic, it always kind of, you get to this point, like somebody like Elizabeth Warren talking about, well, okay, the rich need to pay their fair share, or Bernie Sanders. It's like, all right, well, you guys are worth like 20-30 million dollars or whatever it is, right? That's a pretty like serious sum of money. So why are you guys not volunteering to cut the treasury an extra $1 million a year in taxes? If the problem is that like people aren't paying enough in taxes, why don't you, if you owe $700,000 a year this year in taxes, why don't you just round it up to 2 million and send the treasury that check? This way, that you're doing the altruistic thing and kind of eating your own cooking. And they'll never do that, because they want to keep that money. Why? Because like for the same reason everybody wants to keep a hold of their money. They know the government will piss it away. They'll never see it again, and it will never be returned onto them in the same benefit as it will be for them to spend it on their own behalf. And so there's a broader statement to be made there. And people on the left, it's a cauldron of ignorance about the issue and not seeing through the logic of the situation, mixed with trying to make an argument that's mostly emotional and not practical. It's very similar to illegal immigration. Like, how are you going to kick these people out? You're going to separate them from their children? It's like, okay, like those are very emotional arguments that like pulling your heartstrings. But like at the end of the day, the reality of the situation is we can't afford it. It's dangerous. Americans are dying as a result of it, and it's putting significantly more strain on the taxpayer, which harkens back to this other issue we're talking about. So, at some point, it's like your personal life, man. You might like me, but there's probably things I could say to you right now on this podcast that would piss you off enough where you'd say, I never want to talk to that guy again. He's an asshole, right? Because you have boundaries. You have, everybody's got a line that like, if you cross with them, that's it. They don't want to talk to you again. Or if you cross with them, they're going to throw a punch or whatever. And so we have to be the same way with how we look at these problems. Like we can't always just resign to what the heart wants. There has to be some head in the situation too. And taxation problem, I think, falls under that. Something like taxing unrealized gains is such a dangerous idea, and it got thrown around as though it's so like it's some time-tested, proven method for taxation. All because they say, oh, hey, well, we can raise an extra like trillion, or we can raise an extra 2 trillion. It's like, yeah, all right, well, what are you going to do with that? You going to fucking give it to Ukraine? Are you going to fucking lose it at the Pentagon somewhere in some kind of black book project that nobody hears about? Like, where's that money going to go? And by the way, when are people going to pay attention to what the consequences are of taxing unrealized gains, which is going to disincentivize investing in real estate, investing in the stock market, keeping your financial assets in the country. So, fuck around with that and find out what happens was basically the blog post that I wrote about that, because it would destroy the US economy. There would be hundreds of billions of dollars that would leave the country. It would be so regressive, and it would probably take a year to figure that out. Thank God we averted that crisis, but the broader point is it's never going to be enough. And the problem is always we're just not taking in enough. The question is, the answer is, hey, like we have enough and we're taking in enough. We need to hold people accountable, and we need to watch how we're spending.
Yeah, completely agree. I said to someone on a podcast the other day, no matter whether it's personal life or government or local council, local government, whatever it might be, you've got to be efficient and effective at doing something. Because if you're spending more than your income, I mean, that might be okay for a month or so, but if that's continual, you're going to be in the shit before you know it. So I do think that level of accountability is important.
I always say at the home level, at the corporate level, at the municipal level, at the state level, the name of the game is you have to spend less than you bring in. That's
Mm.
it. That's how you save money, right? That's what everybody's supposed to be doing. So what about the sovereign level makes things different? What, the fractional
Exactly.
reserve central banking model? Like what,
Mm.
why do all the rules of economics go out of the window? When I can draw a straight line between balancing my checkbook here at home, and if I make, $3,000 a month, saying, okay, I'm paying 800 in rent, I got 2,200 left. I'm gonna pay, 200 in utilities, I got 2,000 left. Okay, I'm gonna spend 500 on food. Okay, I got 1,500 left. And I'm going to spend 500 on health insurance. I got 1,000 left, and 250 on discretionary spending, subscriptions, whatever. That leaves me with $750 at the end of the month that I can bank into a savings account. Do that for 10 months. I got $7,500 saved up, eventually save up enough to buy a house and continue, improving my quality of life. It's a pretty simple, what I don't do is I don't make 3,000 and then go out and put 5,000 on the credit card every month, because you do that, you're heading towards bankruptcy very quickly. It won't be long before the credit cards start calling, and then they take you to court, and then they get a default judgment, and then you try to get a loan and you can't, and everything's fucked, and you got to file for bankruptcy. So at the personal level, there's consequences. At the municipal level, there's consequences. Me and you ran a business together, there's consequences. Businesses go bankrupt all the time. Too much liabilities, too little assets. They're not generating enough cash. They don't have enough, cash in the bank for a rainy day. There's consequences. So how come on the sovereign level, when you get to the United States government, all of a sudden it's like, okay, there's no rules here. We can be spending more than we're bringing in every year. We can run $1 trillion deficit, and we can continue to rack up this perpetual debt number, and everything's fine because modern monetary theory, and we can print money, and the central banking model allows it. You either buy that okay, like academia has figured out some fucking loophole to lead us to never-ending prosperity where everything's going to be perfect all the time and there will never be any consequences, and we can do whatever we want at the sovereign level, whether it's add $1 trillion or 10 trillion a year to the national debt, doesn't matter. We can print the money. You either believe that that's a logical, sound line of thinking, or you believe that at some point there's going to be a giant disaster that comes down the road somewhere, so that something's going to break. And like many people from the Austrian school, that's what I believe. I don't know how it's going to manifest, and I don't know when.
But it will at some point. And then that gets me on to where I wanted to wrap up. Because again, I just wanted to refer to another article that you wrote recently as well. And that's talking about silver. Now, I
Yeah.
know that there's a lot of stuff going out there about gold, and that's on its own path, to be fair, for pretty much all the reasons that you and I have just spoken about. But silver, whether it's a return of the gold silver ratio, the GSR, to a more suitable level, or industrial uses, etc., etc., people really aren't paying attention on it. Why do you think that is? And then where do you think what is likely to happen to silver moving forward? Like a 30,000 foot view, so to speak.
Well, I think, gold has made this tremendous move and silver hasn't really moved with it. And at least not in lockstep. So that would kind of lead one to believe that it does have some catching up to do. Um, I like silver. The article that I wrote was called, and actually it was some commentary that I wrote, but then it was also a some content from Peter Schiff, where he had also written about the gold to silver ratio. And it's a good read. You can read it on his blog, which is on schiffgold.com, or on mine if you'd like. Um, but just talking about the gold to silver ratio, and how, like, really, if it were to snap back to some type of historical average of sorts, that silver would be valued much higher based on where gold is valued today. And so I think silver has kind of been neglected to some degree. The miners in both gold and silver, I think, are still huge opportunities. I don't think that they have moved nearly as much as they should relative to what the underlying has done. But yeah, I was listening to a great podcast this morning on my run. Bill Fleckenstein, who I really respect, was talking to Julia LaRoche, who's actually doing a nice podcast. She's come around to the Austrian school, Julia LaRoche. She used to be like Yahoo Finance, traditional, financial reporter. She used to work for Business Insider back in the day. Actually, a very sweet girl. I met her at Sohn 2016, I think. But woman, not girl, very sweet woman. But her podcast is great. She has all these Austrian school guys on, all these gold and silver guys, and Fleckenstein was talking about this this morning, saying that a lot of the actually saying a lot of the demand for gold and silver is coming from China and India now, and still isn't coming from the U.S. Um, and I wish I could remember off the top of my head some of the points that he made. But I would recommend that people go and listen to that podcast. It's only 45 minutes. It's the Julia LaRoche show, Bill Fleckenstein interview from February like 18th or something. Um, but yeah, I think silver has a lot of catching up to do relative to where even gold is right now. And I think I don't know if I buy into the all of the theories that it's being suppressed. My friend Andy Sheckman would probably know more about that. But just using common sense and just going based on a feeling, I feel like when it catches on, I think silver is going to outperform gold because silver is really, in a physical sense, is much easier to attain and stack for wealth preservation purposes than gold if you're a retail investor, because you can buy it in $30 increments or $300 increments, as opposed to having to buy a $2,900 ounce of gold or $25,000 bars of gold or whatever. And there's been something very strange happening with all these gold stacking up at the COMEX. It appears as though somebody is hell bent on taking delivery from a lot of gold futures contracts, which I gotta think is China or India or Russia somehow. And things kind of changed when we weaponized the dollar against Russia when they invaded Ukraine, I think back in 2020. And I think, Fleckenstein said it this morning on this podcast that like maybe a lot of people are starting to think about prioritizing gold instead of prioritizing treasuries as a reserve asset. And that makes sense. So with that, I think gold and silver will move in tandem to some degree, but I think relative to gold, I think silver is lagging right now. And so I think there's an opportunity there based on where gold is today. And certainly the miners I've been talking about for a while, a lot. My buddy Larry Lepard would tell me that the miners aren't moving with the underlying because the forecast that's built into the model for a lot of these companies still forecasts, $2,000 gold next year or $2,100 gold next year. And just the price has done nothing but go up. I mean, we're at all-time highs today. We're about to get through 3,000. And I don't know what that market looks like. I don't know what the paper to physical ratio looks like and is supposed to be. I'm not on the microscopic level. I just know that like out of all options, I love gold. There's a reason central banks hold it in reserve, even above, this is putting aside Bitcoin. This is above anything else. Gold and silver to me represent like the purest way to preserve wealth and to preserve your purchasing power at any given time. And I've been saying that for 10 years now. Here we are at $3,000 gold. And I think just like anything else, I was talking to a guy last night at dinner about, the S&P to gold ratio and how for that to correct to historical norms, the S&P would have to either take like a 70% drawdown or gold would have to 10x. And so like, at some point these historical averages will once again return, or at least will converge closer to it. And one of those that I think will snap back to is the historical, gold to silver ratio, which looking at it today would dictate to me that silver should be higher. And so you listen to a guy like Schiff or Andy Sheckman or any of these guys, and they're or even my friend Larry Lepard, and they're gonna tell you like, hey, like, once it hits 50, it's gonna be at 100, relatively quickly. They all seem to think that it's going to move like greased owl shit once it gets some momentum behind it. And I still think the miners and silver, specifically the metal, are just so unloved right now. Like they don't get TV time. They don't get mainstream media talk yet. It's not the trade, like the trade right now is AI and the trade is tech and it's all these 45x PE fucking tech companies. At some point, gold and silver are going to be the trade. And I think you want to own it before that point. That becomes the point when the world's piling in that you want to think about paring back. And I think probably if I had to, if today you had to offer me, $1 million in gold or $1 million in silver, I would probably take, and I could only pick one, I'd probably take the silver. With storage constraints out of the picture,
Mm-hmm.
I'd take the silver because I think it'll gain in general as gold gains, but I think it'll gain relative to gold too. And it's slept on. Nobody's talking about it at all.
No, indeed it's not. And I had Dom Direct on recently, and his setup. He's a very intelligent man, looking at all forms of junior miners, mainstream, Barrett, Newmont, so forth. And his point that he made on the podcast was that ultimately, if you believe that gold and silver are going to go much higher, 5, 10 years, whatever it might be. He said, ultimately, if that's your thought, then miners are where you need to be because it's all about those margins, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that doesn't mean go out and buy every single mining company you can find. Obviously, you've got homework to do, et cetera, et cetera. But that was the point he was trying to make. Is that if you think gold and silver is going to go much higher, that's the space you want to be in.
Yeah.
And so be it.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And then, I think the terminus for that it becomes, at some point, if we get back on some type of standard or the dollar is challenged globally, did the miners get nationalized at some point? But I think that's 10, 15 years down the road if it happens. So that's not something I'm worried about. I think there'll be a lot of gains to be made in the miners if everything stays as it is right now.
Yeah, and if you're lucky enough to hold a physical position in gold, silver, or both, I've had people ask me before about monetary reset and stuff like that. So, well, that's not the reason I bought it in the first place. There's 5 or 6 other reasons, in my opinion, more important. That's why I've accumulated a position. But ultimately, if there is some form of physical reset, then that's just an advantage, and I'll deal with that as and when. But it wasn't. That's
Right.
not my number one. So I wouldn't. If people are listening to this, going, "Well, Scott Bessent said this, and this might happen," don't just make that number one reason. There are so many other reasons why you want physical first. But if that does happen,
Yeah,
that's
any
a winner.
like the finite assets with a fixed supply, and real estate you could probably put in the same category in terms of just preserving your wealth and not having to, being able to kind of dodge the inflation erosion that happens on a yearly basis. Um, I don't think as far as commodities go, I don't think it gets much better than gold and silver. You can probably throw real estate in there too.
Agreed. I think that's probably a good place to finish, to be fair, Chris. I think we've covered a lot of obviously covered a lot at the start about mental health, and I just want to reiterate that message. Anyone listening to this, that if you do have challenges, anything like that, please do go and get some help. Try and seek, get yourself on the path. I think that's very important. Then we've covered Doge and sitting on the fence in terms of, well, let's just see what happens. We definitely need it. And then gold and silver. I think that's probably a good place to end. And is there anything else you would like to add? And how can people find you and get hold of you as well?
My Substack is called Fringe Finance. Happy to come back on anytime. Happy that you invited me. It was great to meet for the first time, and great discussion, man. Hope we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. People listening on the podcast, if you head to, you can find QTR Fringe Finance. If you head over to contrariancapitalist.substack.com, I'll make sure I put all the necessary links in there as well. So I'd recommend go and search out Raven QTR's Fringe Finance. Chris, yeah, lovely to meet you for the first time as well. Thought that went really well, and look forward to catching up in the future.
Sounds great. Yeah. Thanks so much, Rob. Talk to you soon.